Chapter 9. Dictograph Incident. The words persecution and prejudice, which were to figure so prominently at the trial of Frank, first commenced to be heard soon after the coroner's long inquest had ended. Then it was learned that Solicitor General Hugh M. Dorsey had become so interested in the case that he had hired private detectives to make an independent probe of the tragedy. It was then generally known, despite the fact that he had made no formal announcement, that Dorsey was convinced that Frank was guilty, and it was said that he had employed detectives not to work with open minds towards solving the mystery, but to seek only evidence against Frank. While it was true in neither case, the same thing was said about the city detectives, and friends of the accused man commenced to declare that he was persecuted because of his race. The Jews of Atlanta were then, and are to this good day, firmly convinced, or rather they say that they are convinced, that Frank is an innocent man. Not as reticent as Dorsey, the city detectives freely declared that they were firm in the conviction that in Frank they had the murderer. Continually, however, they protested that they were open to conviction, and would follow to the bitter end any clue that presented itself, even though it pointed away from Frank. If the solicitor's detectives unearthed anything in the case, it will probably remain a mystery, as they left the job after about 10 days, and have never appeared in Atlanta again. For several weeks after the coroner had committed Frank and Newt Lee to the Tower as suspects, there were continued rumors that a young girl had been heard talking on street corners and saying that she met Mary and waited outside the factory while she went up and got a paycheck from Frank. Finally, the detectives located the woman in question, and it developed that it was on the Saturday preceding the tragedy that she went to the factory with the girl who met her death there a week later. Colonel Thomas B. Felder, well-known Atlanta attorney, had announced shortly after the coroner's inquest that he had been employed by citizens of Bellwood, the district in which Mary Fagan lived, to find and prosecute the girl's murderer. He stated that in his opinion the murderer was really Leo M. Frank, but declared that it was necessary for the citizens of Georgia to hire detectives who could and would solve the mystery, and secure evidence enough to convict Frank if he was guilty, or any other man if Frank was innocent. The colonel did not express a very high regard for Chief Lanford and the city detectives, and as to the Pinkertons, he quoted many rumors which said they were working not to solve the mystery, but to shield Frank. Colonel Felder was a personal friend of William J. Burns. Felder declared that if the public would assist him by donating to a fund, that he would get Burns, who was then in Europe working on the Martin disappearance mystery, to come to Atlanta and take up the hunt for the factory girl's slayer. Subscriptions came in rapidly, and on May 18th, C. W. Tobey, special investigator, came to Atlanta to gather up the loose strings and pave the way for his famous chief. Soon after his arrival, Tobey gave out an interview in which he said that his theory of the crime coincided exactly with that then entertained by the city detectives. For about a week, Felder and the Burns people were the figures of chief interest in the manhunt. P. A. Flack, a New York fingerprint expert, was brought here by Solicitor Dorsey, but had remained only for a day, and after examining the notes found by the body, declared that by handling them so much, the detectives had destroyed a vital clue. He could tell nothing about the notes because of the condition in which he found them, he said. Charges that a vast corruption fund had been raised to save Frank, guilty or innocent, were heard frequently at this time, although they were never sustained. It was charged that the Pinkerton operatives employed by the pencil company were double-crossing the city police, working with them simply to learn their secrets and report them to the attorneys for the defense of Frank. Another charge was that Felder and the Burns people, while posing as the manhunters, were really employed by Frank's friends to shield him. The city detectives were suspicious of the Burns people, not only failed to give them any assistance, but had every Burns operative shadowed. While the charges were never substantiated, the suspicions of the city detectives culminated in the dictagraphing of Colonel Felder by agents in the employ of Chief Lanford. On May 23rd, the Atlanta Journal sprang the famous dictagraph sensation, devoting its entire front page to the scoop. Chief Lanford charged that Colonel Felder had sought to bribe C.G. February, his stenographer, to steal certain affidavits and papers in the Fagan case. The dictagraph records, which were printed in full, are too lengthy to reproduce here. In substance, the alleged records showed that Felder was negotiating for the purchase of certain affidavits, which, it was alleged, would show up the city detective department, proving that the chief and some of the members were corrupt. February, it seems, acting under instruction, had led the attorney to believe that he could obtain certain papers in the Fagan mystery, which would prove corruption in the department. The deal was negotiated through A.S. Collier, an adventurer formerly from Tennessee. In the dictagraph records, Mayor James G. Woodward was also involved, it being alleged that he sanctioned the alleged effort on the part of Felder to get the goods on the detectives. Nothing was accomplished by the dictagraph exposure, although it led to a sizzling war of words between Felder and Lanford. This battle of vituperation resulted in a near physical combat between the two principals when they met in the courthouse, but deputy sheriffs prevented the actual passing of blows. It is claimed that Felder reached in his pocket at the time for a revolver, but when the charge was made before the grand jury, it failed to return an indictment. The net result of the grand jury's investigation of the sensational dictagraph incident was that it indicted Felder for libeling Lanford and Lanford for libeling Felder in their several public attacks on each other. While the Felder-Lanford controversy had little to do with the Fagan murder mystery, it served to intensify the public interest in the crime and to make rumors that unseen hands were at work harder to down. Also, it served to end the connection of the Burns detectives with the case. The war of words was at its height, and the city detectives were trailing the Burns men even to their meals. "This is a hell of a family row, and no place for a stranger," said Burns investigator Toby, and he grabbed a train for New York. On Friday, May 23rd, the Fulton County Grand Jury took up the consideration of a bill charging Frank with murder. The witnesses who were heard at the first day's session were Dr. J. W. Hurt, the county physician, whose evidence did not reach the public until the Frank trial, Police Sergeant S. L. Dobbs, R. P. Barrett, who discovered the blood on the second floor of the factory and strands of a girl's hair near the same place, Detective J. N. Starnes, and W. W. Rogers. The second day's session of the grand jury resulted in the returning of a true bill, despite the fact that hundreds of people had declared that Frank would never be indicted for the crime. Among the most important witnesses of the second session were Harry Scott, the Pinkerton, and Miss Montine Stover. The girl was a new figure in the case and a witness of much importance. She told the grand jury in substance that when going to get her paycheck on Saturday, April 26, she walked into Superintendent Frank's office at exactly 12:10 p.m. The office was perfectly empty, she asserted, and expecting someone to come in momentarily, she waited for 5 minutes. Failing to see Frank or any of the office force, she left the building and returned the following Saturday, when Pinkerton operatives found her. The girl had not testified at the coroner's inquest, although located before the final session, and detectives admitted that they were saving her as a star witness. Immediately after he located Montine Stover, Harry Scott of the Pinkertons, with John Black of the city force, visited Frank at the tower and said, "Did you leave the office at any time between 12 and 12:50 o'clock Saturday?" "No," answered Frank. "Think about it and be as positive as you possibly can," said Scott. "I am absolutely certain that I didn't leave my office from the time Miss Hall, my stenographer, left until I went up to the fourth floor to tell Arthur White's wife that I was going to lock the building," he replied. In other words, the girl came in at the exact time the state contends Frank was back in the metal room choking the life out of Mary Fagan's body. The testimony of the girl was considered by the solicitor as of extreme importance. It was doubly valuable because at that time it was the only flaw the police had found in Frank's story, as told at the inquest. Try as they would, they could not break it, for every point that could be corroborated by witnesses was found to be true. Monteith Stover's story was considered a clincher, and the grand jury returned the true bill, when Scott followed her on the witness stand and gave his story of Frank's repeated assertions that he did not leave his office during the interval mentioned. Grand jury sessions are secret, but the testimony of every witness who went before the body, except Dr. Hertz, was known to the public at the time, and no facts except Monteith Stover's story, which were not placed before the coroner's inquest, were heard by the 23 men who formally indicted Frank for the crime. There were 5 Jews on the grand jury, an unusual number for Fulton County, and before the indictment was returned, there were many rumors that they would block it. However, if a single vote was cast against the bill, the fact never became known, as every member signed the indictment. Frank had not expected an indictment, and had confidentially told friends that a grand jury would never formally charge him with the crime. In his cell in the tower, however, he took the news quietly, as he has taken practically every turn in the case. He took much consolation from the fact that a grand jury hearing is ex parte, and his side was presented by no one.